Okay, cool. There, right? Okay, fair enough. Okay, once again, welcome to our second LDRR. My name is Sagar, and as I introduced myself last week, and we've also got Tanmay and Sudesh, our other BigTh members, leaders. So first of all, we only have 5 members, but we expected to have more people rolling in as the meeting goes by. So hope to have a bigger group for discussion. So for today, we'll pick up from where we dropped off last week. Now, I have a vague feeling that some of the members here didn't attend last week's LDRR, but no problem. It's nothing related, so we can start afresh. Now, what we basically are going to do this hour is we're going to discuss about, or we're going to talk about topics related to the field of AI. And there is no theme as such connecting all of this apart from the fact that they're AI related. And this is one of our prompts that we said we will discuss or we'll talk about or ponder upon in this section. So as you can see in front, that's the prompt. How can AI revolutionize the job hiring practices? And I would like to hand it over to Tanmay to lead this section. Tanmay, it's all yours.
So thank you, Sagar. So obviously the prompt is, how can AI revolutionize job hiring practices? So essentially, we've always seen how job hiring works. You upload a resume, and once if the employers like the resume, then you get an interview, such and such. Now, there certainly have been many progressions toward the hiring process. There have been many ways. The technology companies have made it easier for the people to upload their resumes or try to find jobs. Like, for example, LinkedIn, Glassdoor, Indeed, and what I want to today, but they're not like necessarily AI, I guess. So essentially, one example of such an AI type of hiring process would be HireVue. I recently applied for JP Morgan, in which they pretty much used HireVue as well. In a way, it kind of uses AI in that, like, they've asked you like certain questions such as like your programming experience, and then they ask you a couple coding challenges to like see how the experiences pay off, such and such. Essentially, the AI mainly though is like how they allow you to record videos of yourself talking to explain the solution and stuff like that. So what I really want to hear is like, what do you think? How can AI revolutionize job hiring practices, like HireVue, for example? Anyone can talk. Let's try Austin. Maybe you want to, let's try to start off there.
So is the HireVue like the video thing? How does AI come into play with that? Is it like, what is it using AI for? I guess is my question.
I guess it's using AI to like decide what type of coding challenges you could do.
Oh.
Or
and
like
just to add to and just to add to Tanmay's point, HireVue, the company's claims that they use facial recognition technology to analyze how the interviewees are performing. So, for instance, if the interviewee is nervous, then the HireVue facial recognition algorithm can track if that person is nervous or confident, or if that particular person seems knowledgeable or not. So these are some of the AI applications that we are able to see in hiring practices. So what essentially we want to know from you all is, what are your thought processes on how AI will redefine hiring practices, or how people are hired, and what the metrics are? All yours.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I understand now. I've only gotten like what is it, code forces, challenges, and hacker ranks and all that stuff. I haven't gotten high review yet, but I honestly don't know how I feel about AI going into the coding challenges online. A lot of people complain about it for high review. I just didn't know what they were complaining about. I guess it might be about the AI concept. I think it kind of like takes out the human element um, too much when it comes to getting hired. Um, so I don't know if I necessarily agree with it as of right now, but I understand how it could screen out candidates and narrow down the potential hirees.
Austin, to kind of go off your point, you're right, it could take out the human element. But I mean, in times of during the pandemic, often video chats are a little hard to, connect sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, maybe in a way the AI can benefit during this time. I mean, yeah, the pandemic's not going to last forever, sure. But still, in like times of crises, sometimes maybe the AI is probably the better option, at least to stay safe in some ways.
Right, and I understand how there's thousands of people that apply to. I guarantee there's thousands of people that applied to the J.P. Morgan job, and so you for these instances, I guess cuts down on time and just narrows down the field of candidates. So it makes
Yeah,
sense.
like all these platforms record every keystroke you pressed during the interview and like every click you made and all that. Like how many times you rewrote your code or like how many thought process you went through to like actually write your code for the question. So they can have like more insight regarding how the candidate thinks or like how he performs, and they can like choose better, I guess. That's how this helps.
Mm.
Sorry, is this within the context of coding tests?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Sorry.
Point, I mean, one of the things about, I mean, while we were discussing the positives, the most obvious one is that AI algorithms can enable companies to weed out, the cream of the cream members from the others. So it does benefit in the sense that algorithms can sort people out into the best fit for the company depending on whatever coding challenges are offered, as Tanmay discussed. Companies do that with AI models. They're dishing out coding challenges to people. But I was just thinking about it on the flip side. So when we think about hiring practices, we think about the HR team, the human resources team, where apart from relevant work experience, they look at a person's fit with respect to the company values, morals, traditions, basically things that you can't really quantify. So it goes back to how can an AI algorithm determine if a person fits into the values or is just a fit for the company, leaving aside the technical aspects, because I think that's where a human triumphs over AI. So could have discussions on that, or any kind of thoughts, or any kind of disagreements, anything. And you need not necessarily use the you could use the chat option if that's how you feel comfortable sharing your opinion. Anyone?
So on the matter of how to quantify it, I don't remember if it was specifically Facebook or Amazon, but one of the two already did such a thing in which they looked at some of the common numerical qualities of people they've already hired and had high valuations within their internal, you know how like you're surveyed by your managers, or I should say evaluated by your managers at the end of an internship period. They used a lot of the categorical and numerical qualities that they got from those evaluation results about companies that were employees that were highly rated there. And they used these qualities in order to bias what applications would be viewed more so. And as a result, because of the higher skew towards more men in the company, there was a lawsuit that was published against them since one of those categorical qualities that was shared among their higher rated employees was that they were primarily men, and as a result it was discriminating against women, so they had to stop using such a program. So it's possible to find some sort of intangible correlation. However, what you have to be careful of is the entire correlation versus causation deal that is inherent to pretty much anything data science. And for that matter, this idea that even if there was a strong correlation between certain qualities that you'd find in a hiring practice with actual performance, you also may want to consider, I don't think it's very indicative of one's capability to learn further in the future. I mean, this is just anecdote, not necessarily statistical backing, but I mean, a friend of mine was working over at Dick's Sporting Goods in their online division for sales, where he was working along people who were Ivy League students. On paper, you know, generally would be associated with better performance, but they didn't get return offers at all because they could barely know how to code. So perhaps on paper they might have had better credentials, but that said nothing as to their learning capability, or even if they did start out better, whether or not they'd be able to adapt to the technology as fast.
Essentially what he's saying is, correlation does not necessarily mean causation, because what algorithms and programs do is that they collect data points and statistics and try to map a picture, which they then assume is the true story of the thing. Whereas, in reality, numbers might say something, but that might not reflect the entirety of a situation. So I think Caleb raises a very good point there. Another thing he also spoke about was, the criteria that goes behind, judging and analyzing people as a possible fit for the company. And he specifically mentioned, the bracket about how men are end up getting hired at a much more efficient rate than women. So another thing that we could possibly talk about is who decides these criteria, and who basically is the arbitrator for these criteria and evaluating things. Because I think if there's no standard across the board, then things might be skewed based on personal biases or preferences. Anyone who could go off that topic? Marianne, anything to share?
Yeah, I guess what you said about there being biases in, who's making the code, who's implementing it. I'm trying to think of what to say.
That's fine. You can take your time.
I do also think that in the case of the Dick's Sporting, your friend was working next to Ivy League people. In that case, the higher view probably would have come in handy, right? Because it would have analyzed their ability to code.
Oh, you talking about how higher view could potentially be a good, intermediary in weeding out the best fit from the others? Is that what you're suggesting? Or
yeah, right. Just so like
Review kind of does that though. They use the coding challenges. They get like you can choose your code, you choose whatever language you want, and like they'll give you the challenges. There's usually 2, I think, and then they allow you to choose which language you can do, from Java to C++ to Python, or even C itself. Essentially like that. Is that what you're kind of like trying to say? Or?
No, he was saying how his friend was right next to Ivy League students and they didn't get return offers because they didn't know how to really code. In that case, HireVue would have came in handy to screen out those candidates.
Yeah, I can see like HireVue definitely would have been able to, because it like kind of, it doesn't just show like, it's not just the paper that's telling it.
Right.
It show like, can you actually just code in general?
Right. And I do think, yeah, in the case of like tests, AI coding tests, they come in handy because then you're not really looking at the person's resume and like what school they went to. Now you're looking at their talent instead. So
I think generally,
And again, within the context, that may not be the only thing that's indicative of what they might be capable of doing. Even then, I mean, yes, I mean, even then there's going to be a significant amount of people that are going to pass those tests, and there's going to be some measurement that can narrow down. I mean, well, okay, what I'm suggesting here is that they use more factors than simply a coding test, because a lot of people can pass those, at which point they have to use what other experiences that the candidate offers in order to determine if they're a fit for the company. That's where the capacity for some form of bias in whatever indicators that you'd have to train the AI on in order to use come in.
I mean, why I like that particular point is because, let's talk about regular hiring practices. Now, how we go through hiring practices, how we go through the hiring processes. Yeah, we'd send an application, but to stand a better chance of getting a job or internship of your liking, you'd look at contacts or recommendations from people who are connected to individuals in a particular organization of your choosing. So over there, you can see that there is an inherent bias in the system, in the sense that people who are hired usually tend to have some kind of internal links or contacts, which translates to the fact that if you have someone who you're close to within that organization, then you stand a better chance. So there are those kind of biases. Now, can an AI, can an algorithm of that sort remove those biases? Well, while we could say yes, Caleb raised the point that while there were AI, algorithms in place, the people who were fine tuning the criteria or the parameters were themselves biased. So basically the creators of algorithms themselves, induced a bias. Is that what you're suggesting, Caleb? That
I don't think personally they induced it. I just think that they didn't clean up the data enough to avoid it.
Okay, so you're saying it was it was a systemic bias?
Yes.
Right. So basically, when you go back to it, AI, what we are coming to discuss is that any AI algorithm is just, it's an effective sorter, but it still has those same flaws that we humans have. That there is some kind of bias which could have negative impacts on us. Now, that is an interesting point, but we've been talking about all negative aspects. How could we improve on this, or how could we make algorithms better at hiring the best minds without having any kind of bias towards a particular gender or particular community or particular race or particular sector?
I guess what AIs can, or at least companies that make the AIs, do those things. I guess what they could do most likely is, I guess, like, I think we're going back to Kayla's point, they should probably just clean out the data that kind of like allows them to pick some unqualified candidates, even though they could instead of the more qualified ones. And in doing so, I guess they could fix some. I guess they could make certain coding challenges like harder. At least, they could get their so that like the candidates can use their critical thinking more, and that way, if they are able to solve it, if not like fully, but like at least enough to, like at least to think about the correct way to do it, then it shows like this guy's more qualified than ever. Because like if you give like something easy, such as like reverse string, let's say, then it's like doesn't really teach you anything because it's like easy to do. Like anyone could do that with just given time. But like if you give something harder, let's say I don't know, nothing like too big. Like I guess you could do like a sorting algorithm, but like not like the same sorting algorithms that we'd learn in like 351 or whatever, but like something related to that. Then I suppose maybe that could also change the quality of candidates that end up getting accepted, for those getting not. And maybe for like the facial recognition, I guess there maybe fix whatever bugs they have. I'm not sure how to really fix it though, but definitely somewhere there, at least to pick more like not just male candidates, but also female as well.
Now that you've mentioned about it, a very interesting thought came up in my mind. So while we were talking about HireVue and their claim that they use facial recognition technologies to weed out candidates, now what they're basically doing is they're basically conducting a psychometric test, right, where they analyze your facial cues and your verbal cues to make a judgment about what kind of a person you are. Now, if you come to think of it, isn't that some kind of invasion into privacy? Because using a technology to judge a person and basically trying to crack open that private side and try to figure out if that person is suitable or not. Is that a conversation that we can say is valid in this context? Does AI powered hiring practices that involve facial recognition be, what do you say, an encroachment on our privacy? Anyone? Austin, any thoughts?
I don't know if it's like an invasion of privacy. So I mean there's plenty of other, I guess, I don't know.
I mean, yeah, Karen.
I guess, are you trying to say like it would be just to base it off your facial recognition? You shouldn't bias off of someone's facial emotions.
I think I was a little unclear when I said that. When you conduct psychometric tests, you need to seek consent before you're able to,
Right.
before they're able to conduct some kind of psychometric tests on you, right? So if you've got a hiring software that uses facial recognition technologies to conduct, in a way, psychometric tests, because essentially what is a psychometric test? It is the study of a person's facial cues or body language to make a judgment or to understand that person's psychology or how that person is. Now, when psychometric tests require a consent form, then why should AI hiring practices not have that? I mean, when you essentially go for a HireVue interview, they're conducting that, but they're not explicitly seeking consent now, are they?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So like code forces, I don't know if they use AI, but they do make sure to obtain your consent before they record you, because you have to be on video and you have to show your ID and all that. So I don't know for higher view, but yeah, if they don't ask your consent beforehand, then obviously I do think it would be an invasion of privacy.
Okay, now that you mentioned the thing, fair enough. That actually stands as a fair point. Uh, Marianne, Caleb, any thoughts on that along those lines?
Yeah, I don't know if it produces as much of a privacy risk in the sense that if you're consenting to it, then that eliminates it. But if the AI has to base their decision of who they think a person is based on their facial cues, how they look, I think that might produce a bias, and the AI will just keep feeding information off of that.
Now that you mentioned that, I think Caleb had hinted towards, how they're biased towards a particular gender. Now, I recently read this, this article where what I understood from the article was that facial recognition technologies have when you conduct facial recognition, it tends to favor people of a particular race as opposed to another. Now, is that something that could potentially go against the argument of involving AI in hiring practices? Roth, what's your thought on that?
I just came in. I'm still trying to read the room, but I will pitch in a few minutes once I get a hold of what's going on.
Fair enough. No, I'm. So what else? I mean, these are the what do you say? The context of this article was that AI-based facial recognition technologies couldn't interpret people of color as well as they did people of a particular race or ethnicity. So therein lies a problem that AI-based algorithms, are inefficient in identifying or analyzing people of a particular race. Now, when you incorporate that fairly flawed system into something as important as hiring for positions, we always complained, right? I mean, not we don't always, but there was a time when we criticized certain companies or certain organizations for hiring people of a particular community or group. So when AI is doing that, not for any personal bias of their own, but because of some kind of systemic error which hasn't been addressed, then wouldn't that raise a number of possible problems?
Absolutely, and I think this is not a problem specifically with AI because there's like a golden standard rule with any sort of machine learning, deep learning, which is garbage in, garbage out. So if you feed data that has been biased over centuries of various treatment and mistreatment of certain people across the board, from like where they live to what kind of work they've been doing to what kind of things they're put in jail for, their criminal records, everything is affected by how the system has treated people over these many years. And if that same data goes into an AI, it's no wonder that the AI is going to try to mimic that. So it's really a problem with the system that's trying to use this as opposed to the tool itself.
Okay, so you're saying that it's not really a fault of the technology, but the fault of the people who create the technology.
Yep, and use it in this way.
But isn't the whole purpose of having something of this sort to eliminate the deficiencies that we have?
Right. So that's how AI is marketed normally, but it's more of an amplification of what is put into it. So if something fair and balanced goes into the predictive algorithm, then you're going to get something with a lot less bias. You're going to get something that's going to actually be accurate and representative of what you're trying to solve. But if you feed it, data that it cannot learn anything better from, it's like telling a kid, I don't know, like, I will think of an example. I will get back. But yeah, it's like telling a kid and expecting them to do something you didn't tell them. It's very hard to expect that.
Yeah. So we've got a lot of interesting thoughts and discussions here. Tanmay, back to you.
So I guess we could move on to the next prompt instead. With recent concerns about hate speech and fake news, where do the ML algorithms come into play? So around the world, obviously in the recent times, there's been a lot of hate crime. There's been a lot of hating news around with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and with the Trump stop the steal, the accusations of voter fraud, even though there's no evidence. They still manage to like flood the news with so much of it. So I guess what I want to know is, how do the algorithms of machine learning come into play here? How are they able to spread the news so quickly? How is it that like so many people around so many places can somehow manage to hear the same thing over and over again? Any thoughts at all? Caleb?
I think that can be divided among multiple different things, both in terms of responses and in terms of spread. So I can't quantify the degree to which this is actually happening. I think it's reported in the news a lot more than it actually is, but there is some amount of culpability in bots on social media specifically being created to detect, using sentiment analysis, language that is on the stronger end of its suggestion, and then amplify that through liking, retweeting, and then commenting whatever gives the biggest reaction. But I'm, again, not entirely certain of just how widespread it is, even though I know that Twitter had to destroy a lot of such accounts. Then there's also the entire role of recommendation algorithms in all of this. This is something that's kind of been well studied. You're more likely to be recommended what it is that you're most likely to watch, because that's best on the creator's end in terms of getting more of their content, exposed out to people that would want their content. And that's good on the content holders, on the content whoever hosts the content. It's better for the content hoster as well, because it allows them to stay on their platform for longer. The result of this is that there is not as much variance, I would think, in terms of the speech that people are exposed to. And as a result, it gives an ability for a lot of users' speech to be amplified in the amount of people that it can reach, because it's specifically being shown to those with similar interests that normally would consume such content. And then there's the counter response to it, which is, I believe I remember reading something about Facebook. Facebook has a two-tiered structure. They have these bots that monitor speech, looking for things that their systems might have flagged, and then they send it over to human users in order to verify whether or not it's actually within their policy guidelines. So there's that as a response. And then there's also something that I think Google's been doing this. I'm not sure about Twitter, where anytime they detect things with false facts by whatever model or guidelines they use, they then provide a link to some sort of source that they've designated to be accurate alongside it, and with a little comment like, if you would like to learn more, go to this site. I definitely know they do that on YouTube all the time for political ads. So there are moves and counter moves that are being done. Personally, I appreciate the counter moves that are being done, but I'm somewhat worried about the concept of free speech and whether or not it can be preserved here, because on both sides, regardless of what part of the political spectrum you belong into, I mean, sometimes in order to make a political point, you're going to say something that is controversial by the guidelines. I mean, even the people that were marching for racial justice say a lot of things on Twitter that can be, rather inflammatory. But the thing is that it's necessary to have a conversation. But on the other hand, you can use it to incite violence. So I don't know, personally, I'm agnostic to it. Free speech versus the very visible need to make this stuff stop.
You think the algorithms tend to make mistakes when spreading news sometimes? Is there something wrong that should be fixed at least?
I don't actually know. I mean, I don't know. While I use social media a lot, I'm pretty much of a lurker. I personally haven't said anything that hasn't been limited, so I don't really know what the limits are. And quite frankly, I don't think anyone else does either, really. I'm gonna be honest, I don't know.
Wait, Tanmay, could you repeat the question you just asked again?
So the question I asked was do you think there's something wrong with the algorithms when it comes to spreading the fake news? Do you think, or at least how do you think they should be fixed in some way?
Right. So I think there's also this is a bit of a macroscopic cultural inclination that is picking up now among big tech. Even Google, Twitter, Facebook. These guys are not. They're trying to move away from being the guys who'll just give it as it is, give you what you want. They're trying to move towards things that are, I guess, some people accuse as being on the left end of the political spectrum, but really it's about fairness and equality to people and not hurting each other based on random things. And so for that reason, I think it is not exactly unbiased. These algorithms, when they promote something, they promote it in a certain context. And normally they don't try to promote tweets or any other thing that might have a lot of hatred or anything within them, except for the purpose of trying to bring it to attention of a lot of people. It's not that they're trying to fuel people's interests with it. That's what I observe.
Going off what Caleb had said, that I actually want to talk about I think all of us know about the whole Twitter thing, right? When ex-President Trump tweeted out things that were erroneous, there was that statement under each of his tweets which said that these tweets may be false, you'll have to go and search up more about this. I think, all of us, or at least most of us, would remember or at least have encountered that. Now, what I was suggesting is, let's keep the playing field level for everyone. So as far as political thoughts or ideas are shared on, on social media platforms, all of them should go through some kind of fact check. This could possibly be done in tandem with organizations like Politico, who conduct fact checks on each and every statement that is made by politicians. So ML algorithms could possibly work in tandem with recognizable organizations like this, and then could send all those those important tweets through this machine and churn out whether it's a valid statement or whether it's riddled with falsehoods or riddled with controversies and things of that sort. Because think about speech and news is that it shapes our thinking and our perceptions about the world around us. So it is, in my belief, it's very important that people have an understanding of what they are taking in. And I think while you can say that it is subjective, we need some level of objectivity when it comes to telling people if this is good enough or not, because people need some kind of starting point from which they can think about particular statements based on their own understanding. But what I'm essentially trying to say is we need, or what I believe is we need that algorithm which can guide people to understand, okay, I'm possibly on the right track or on the wrong track. I mean, after that, it's up to the people, because the thing about free speech is, I mean, as I am the one at the core of free speech is the fact that I can say what I think is right, but the concept of right and wrong then comes into play there, which is where the ML algorithm could direct people towards what is possibly right and what is possibly wrong. Now, this thought that I just shared can have a lot of loopholes, and that is open to discussion. I mean, what are the possible falsehoods or difficulties that you could have in this argument? Rohit, I think you had something to share.
I did, but Austin shared something in the chat, so I think maybe we can talk about that first.
Oh, right. Okay. So Austin has, what do you say, typed, how would you differentiate someone's random thoughts that they decide to post on a social network, and then someone spitting out news facts? Okay. Fair enough. Now, again, Austin raised a very good point, as in, how do these algorithms decide whose tweets or whose messages to consider important enough to do some kind of fact check, as opposed to any person randomly tweeting out stuff? So you know how in Instagram you've got that blue tick, right, alongside a person's profile, which in a way indicates that that person is of public significance or importance. So that would be the basic benchmark for considering tweets for fact check, based on how popular you are in the social media circle. Because the whole concept about power play on social media is that a lot of people leverage their publicity and popularity towards influencing, towards social media influencing, which I believe is how a lot of people are directed towards something or the other. So I think as a basic step, we could look at how significant they are in the social media community. Does that in any way solve that conundrum that could possibly be raised?
Now that's an interesting suggestion, which would be relying on the strength of a social following to help determine if that's a widely accepted truth or not. But the thing is, about truths, it's very hard to prove them to someone who doesn't want to believe it. It's incredibly hard. We have people who don't want to believe in climate change, basic reality. The weather's getting more and more messed up. People are finding it harder to breathe. Particle index is going up. It's insanely, obvious to a lot of people who do believe in science. But for the people who don't believe in science, they view this as a kind of a propaganda sort of thing that, it'll blow over if they ignore it types. It's not easy at all to address that. So that's where this whole conflict is stemming from, is from the people who don't want to be shown that they might be wrong about something. So while the people who do believe in the importance of evidence, cause and effect, reasoning to conclusion, if people believe in the importance of that relation, they will be able to identify truth from falsehoods. But the controversy doesn't stem from those people. It stems from those who don't want to be disproven.
If I may on that. So I study physics, and I remember this one article that rather annoyed me and my physics professor at the time when it came out. Does anyone remember when a lot of large media sources published some findings of an experiment that was going on in Antarctica that was looking for neutrinos?
I might have fleetingly read it. Do you have a link by chance?
I can go and find it.
Okay.
But the conclusion was that it gave insights into new parallel universes, when that was entirely clickbait, and in fact, that was not what was going on by any means, by any measure of the word. If we're going to base fact on popularity of following, I mean, you also have to keep in mind that, like, media sources, at least when it comes to science, because that's sort of where I work in, they are very often wrong or leave out so many details that it very much so skews the interpretation that people who actually study it would understand, and the interpretation that people who don't would get, and it may as well not be fact at all by that point. I mean, Elon Musk, he's an absolute genius and I love him, but I mean, there were a couple times where he was rather stubborn with COVID, and if there was this one really interesting thread that he made with a Harvard professor talking about the unreliabilities of PCR, for example, that, I mean, sure, it was, you know, his accusations about the test were somewhat misguided, but it started a conversation in which actual scientists got involved and managed to have a reasoned discussion with him that the people could see. And yep. The coffee cures cancer is definitely one of those. Yeah. So I mean, it's the suggestion that, one, incorrect presumptions cannot be valuable towards teaching a lesson in that case. Two, that people that are typically popular can much oftentimes be wrong or extremely misguided. And three, a lot of these times, these social media organizations are under some directive by government. By directive, what I mean to say is, like, some law guides what they can allow legally and illegally to be on their site. Suppose that social media had as much power as it did back when Edward Snowden was releasing his report about spying. Presumably, government policy at the time, may have limited social media from allowing that, or not at the time, but now, if we were to put such policies in, would limit his the ability for his report to actually be posted online, and we probably wouldn't know about it. I mean, do we want some organization to have that much control over what we see? Because in that case, that would limit a lot of things that are true, but that whoever controls whatever information would not want us to see to be, well, not visible.
Well said.
Having a lot of interesting conversations. Tanmay, would you, I mean, if you're all fine, could we go on to the next prompt, Tanmay?
Yeah, sure. I guess we can go a bit. I guess that can be our last prompt with 4 minutes left. Essentially, the next one is: assume you are a regulator who had to regulate the use of facial recognition technology. What would your position be? What exactly would you think about? Like, what exactly would you do if you had to regulate facial recognition? What would you do? What would you do, I guess? Or, like, if you don't want to use it, how would you regulate it, or how would you dismiss it or something? Or if you felt like it was doing too much of something or too little, what would you do? So I guess we can start off with, like, for now, with the little time we have, what are some disadvantages that facial recognition have? What are some faults that it has that you would want to regulate? Anyone? Is there anything you can? We have like 3 minutes left, so we can just say whatever.
Marianne, if it's fine, you could possibly share your views. You need not necessarily use the voiced option. You could possibly chat. Marianne, you there?
Yeah. I guess you have to think about when you're regulating the use in terms of, like, what are you looking for when you're using this technology, and also what is most ethical as a regulator.
So why don't we simplify this? Let's talk about facial recognition in the context of, CCTV cameras on the streets, and what facial recognition does is it identifies it can identify you, your address, your name, and everything about you. So there's like a database, and you have this facial recognition technology that tracks people on the streets and can identify who they are, where they're from, and things like that. What do you think about that? Is that a fair use of the technology? I mean, basically surveillancing people. Anyone? Marianne, what are your thoughts on
that? So you said using this technology to surveillance people?
You know how we use facial recognition technologies to track down, enemies of the state or things like that. You get the concept, right? So how about if we use that, indiscriminately? Anyone could talk. I mean, if you have anything, Marianne, you could possibly share, but if not, yeah. So, right. So what Austin said is, if you think about it, as of right now, we are all easy to track. Fair enough. But, we are talking about technology that basically was intended to identify people who are, enemies of the state or terrorists, for example, and we're using that on an indiscriminate level where we're just tracking out everyone. So, any thoughts? I mean, if actually we've run short of time, so if there's any closing comments or any closing thoughts you'd want to share, now's the time.
If not, then I guess we can hand it over to Rohit and Shanil and Samrat.
Right. Tanmay, just before that, I would like to make a few points. So I guess we couldn't elicit a lot of responses for the last one because we ran out of time. But for those of you who attended today's discussion, thank you very much for attending this discussion. Though we were expecting a whole lot more people, didn't pan out that way, but that's fine. It's at least we are engaging in an interesting discussion. Now, what we plan to do for next week is we could possibly pick up on that prompt if popular vote persists or demands that. Else, what we are planning to do is for next week, we are planning to do a few activities. Now, these activities involve puzzles and riddles. And then from that, we'll be transitioning into our theme, our first theme discussion, that is meta reasoning. So hope to see most of you there for next week, and I can hand over the control to Rohit and Samrat. Over to you guys.
Awesome. All right, Sammy, you want to go ahead?